a spring in your step. There is a twinkle in your eye.
I can throw a rhyme down for you real quick. Yes, they call me Thrill. They say that I'm the man. You disagree, how could you? Let me make you understand.
Should we bring her on the show? Can anybody find me? And there she is.
Fresh as some bread, pulled right from the oven. When you feel rejected, you get some my loving.
Take on me.
She looks wonderful. Mom looks amazing.
Somebody to. Okay, more bugger off now. I've got to show it to you.
Like that?
Joseph Jaffe, ladies and gentlemen.
You just made the new intro of the show. Dafka. It's a Yiddish word that translates into contrary or contrarian. A person who is dafka is thought of as irritating, perhaps taking an opposing view to annoy or be different just for the sake of it. Turns out that being dafka might hold the key to survival from a corporate or even military standpoint. In World War Z, a Mossad agent explains to Brad Pitt's character why Israel was far more prepared for a zombie outbreak than the rest of the world. The 10th man principle was cited as the reasoning. It's a devil's advocate position that states if there are 10 people in a room and 9 agree, the role of the 10th is to disagree and point out flaws in whatever decision the group has reached. And so, instead of shooting the messenger, they're given the gun, or at least the flaw, and with it, an opportunity to answer the question, what if we're wrong? What if there is a different way? What if there is a better way? If you thought this was all fictional, well, you'd be mistaken. Many have asked if this principle really exists within Israel's intelligence forces. And according to Colonel Eran Morad, aka Sacha Baron Cohen, who is in the Mossad and also not in the Mossad, I can neither confirm nor deny. Most of us view the world as more benign than it really is, our own attributes as more favorable than they truly are, and the goals we adopt as more achievable than they are likely to be. We also tend to exaggerate our ability to forecast the future, which fosters overconfidence. Now that was a quote from Israeli psychologist and economist Daniel Kahneman, notable for his work on the psychology of judgment and decision-making. Today, we'll get a perspective from Bryce Hoffman and the benefits of red team thinking. This, combined with my heresy approach from Built to Suck, triangulates a point of view that, in my humble opinion, speaks to humility itself, or rather, speaks out against hubris, arrogance, overconfidence, success theater, and the toxic dangers of incumbent thinking. We've always done it that way. That might as well be waving the white flag to the known or often silent enemy. In a time where everything seems to be flipped on its head, where we are seemingly living in the upside down, where convention and norms have been challenged and shattered, perhaps it's time to reach consensus on the role and importance of the contrarian. Unless, of course, you disagree with me. And if you do that, my friends, at your peril. Well, now it's time to bring on Bryce. And Bryce, we were just talking about the quote, about the psychologist that I cited. I don't think he knew that I was going to quote him, but I'm sure we're going to get straight into that. But let me tell you a little bit about Bryce. Bryce Hoffman is an author, speaker, and unconsultant who believes that individuals have the power to transform companies and cultures with the right processes. Hoffman wrote the best-selling book American Icon, Alan Mulally, and The Fight to Save Ford Motor Company. His latest book, Red Teaming: How Your Business Can Conquer the Competition by Challenging Everything, speaks to a system developed by the US military and intelligence agencies to make critical and contrarian thinking part of an organization's strategic planning process. In 2015, Hoffman became the first civilian to graduate from the US Army's Red Team Leader Program at the University of Foreign Military and Cultural Studies at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. That is pretty impressive, but not as impressive as him. Let's bring him on. Bryce, welcome to the show.
Great to be on, Joseph. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being on the show. I mean, I just love this topic. Before we even get into the soliloquy, let me ask you this question: what is, because I love words. Words are important. Words have meaning. What is an unconsultant?
So my background, as you just mentioned, I was a business journalist for 22 years. And after my first book came out, American Icon, Alan Mulally and the Fight to Save Ford Motor Company, I started getting calls from a lot of companies who had read it. It had kind of become a manual for transforming corporate culture. And, from CEOs asking me to come in and talk to their leadership teams. And I go and talk to their leadership teams, and then they'd ask me to come in and help them implement the ideas in the book. And before I knew it, I had ceased to be a journalist and become a consultant, which I, on the one hand, really enjoyed because I found that it's a lot more fun to help companies solve their problems than to write about their problems. But on the other hand, as I began to kind of find myself in that milieu, surrounded by kind of the big consulting companies, some of whom I was in talks to join with what I was doing at the time, I began to feel like it was a bit of a scam, that it was selling people fish rather than teaching them how to fish. Actually, it was worse than that, Joe. It's really the drug dealer model. It's like, you get a little taste of it and then you are addicted and you can't do anything without them. And pretty soon organizations have outsourced thinking to the large consulting companies instead of doing it themselves. And the more I saw of it, the more I came to believe that was really a big part of the problem in business. And so I shifted my focus to teaching people at these companies how to think for themselves and not rely on consultants. And so I hate the term consultant. So that's why I call myself an unconsultant, because when we come into organizations, we don't bring in any answers. We don't tell them this is what you should do. We bring tools and techniques that they can use to do it for themselves.
I mean, I love it. It's contrarian thinking straight away, right? It's being able to zig when the others zag, if you will. So we're going to get back to that. We're going to talk about, the dangers of outsourcing thinking. I mean, if you don't have thinking, if you don't have ideas inside your company, then what do you have, right? You have a bunch of empty containers, vessels, and artificial intelligence, I suppose. But before we do, let's find out a couple of fun facts about you. Okay. This is where you're like, oh boy, what's happening now? Well, I'm going to tell you what's happening now. We're going to find out about the riotous side of you, the troublemaker that you are. You were expelled from college for inciting riots, but went on to teach at Berkeley's Haas School of Business and other business schools. So there you are in the middle of this riot breaking out on a college campus. Can you believe
a little bit older? A little bit older than that, I think. I think you need black and white pictures for it.
So, I mean, there's an interesting story. There's always an interesting story about being. I mean, I guess you were always that. You were always the rebel, the troublemaker, the misfit, the square peg in a round hole. You've probably carried that through in your whole life.
I've always believed in challenging everything. The difference is that I've got older. I've figured out how to do it in a more constructive way, I would say. I kind of, have had an evolution not unlike Winston Churchill's of, as Churchill said, any man who's not a socialist in his youth has no heart. Any man who doesn't become conservative in their old age or more conservative in their old age has no brain. And I think you're right, though. I mean, my favorite word has always been why. But why is a word that it's a powerful word, but like all things that are powerful, it's dangerous. It has sharp edges. And so you can ask why in a constructive way. Like my mentor, Alan Mulally, it was one of his favorite words when he was running Boeing and then running Ford Motor Company. was to just ask why. Why, his first week on the job when he took over Ford Motor Company in 2006, his first question to Ford's design and product team was, where is the Ford Taurus? And they said, well, we just killed it 6 months ago. And he said, why? It was the best-selling American car for years. I remember when it was on the cover of Time magazine, they were talking about how, it was the car that took the crown back from the Japanese in the 1980s. And they said, well, we stopped investing in it. So he said, why? And it became this whole, very quickly, in a matter of 5 minutes, this became a very real conversation, a very deep conversation about the fundamental flaws of Ford Motor Company. But, when you're 21 years old and think you have nothing to lose, you can ask why a little bit too aggressively sometimes, and find your college career derailed by your questions.
You're probably very familiar with the 5 why process as well.
Yes, Toyota.
That's also amazing in terms of being able to it's so simple, and it almost always arrives at a better, more insightful, more thoughtful place.
Absolutely. It's one of my favorite tools, actually. And it really is a great example of red team thinking in action, of the mindset too. By the way, I just have to say, Joseph, I can confirm or deny. So there's no such thing as the 10th man. When I started writing my book, that's how I first was tuned into this idea of red teaming. Was I saw that movie. I'm not a fan of zombie movies. I actually don't like horror movies at all. But several friends of mine whose opinions I value told me that this was the thinking man zombie movie and I should really watch it. And I didn't value their opinions enough to actually go watch it in the theater. But when I was homesick one day and it showed up on Amazon as a new release, I watched it. And that scene struck me so powerfully that you described. And I didn't even watch the rest of the movie. I just wanted to know, is this true? Is this real? Does this exist? Because if this exists, companies need this. And my mind started thinking about, because at the time I had recently been covering the American automobile industry for a number of years. And I started thinking, what if there had been a 10th man at Ford, at General Motors, at Chrysler in the early 1970s, when the Japanese first showed up with their small cars, that all of the cigar smoking executives at those companies sat around guffawing about, no Americans are going to buy a dinky little small car from Japan. They want horsepower and, V8 engines and tail fins. And then they found out that in fact, Americans wanted something that was economical and reliable more. And so what if there had been a 10th man that said, okay, fine, but what if we're wrong? What if people do buy these cars? What's our response going to be? What's our contingency plan? And so when I got better, I went online to look for an Israeli intelligence officer, and it's surprisingly easy, Joseph, to find an Israeli intelligence officer online. And I started a conversation with this gentleman, and I said, so tell me, is the 10th man real? And he said, well, there's no such thing as the 10th man. Nobody in Israeli military intelligence has any idea where they came up with this 10th man thing. But everything else about it is real. And it's not one man, though. It's an entire team. And it's called Ipcha Mistabra, which is Aramaic for, on the contrary, the opposite is true. And it still exists today. In fact, literally last week, I was having a video chat with the recently retired former head of Ipcha Mistabra. And it is, everything else they talk about in the movie is true. It's a group of people whose job it is to take the prevailing thinking of Israeli military intelligence and argue as strongly as possible that it's wrong, that the opposite is true, that they're missing something, not because they are necessarily missing something, but because by challenging it in this intentional and structured and intellectually aggressive way, you find the faults in the thinking, and it forces people to question their assumptions, to challenge their own thinking, and it leads to better results, and it leads to them seeing things that they might otherwise have missed. So I can confirm that it does exist.
I'm looking at lots of comments coming in. Tolga Sertoglu said 10th Man Rule was really interesting at that movie. Tom says Bryce is living and thinking in the tradition of Socrates. And he adds, we need to get Bryce together with Scott Monty, and I want to talk to him too.
Scott Monty is a great friend of mine. When you said he was on, I was like, oh, Scott's on. I've known Scott since he was running social media at Ford Motor Company. He's in fact one of my social media mentors.
Scott Monty may or may not surprise you in the Zoom after show. He has a show at 12, but he said he wanted to be here to cheer you on. And Scott used to work for me at Crayon. I hired him at Crayon, and when he went to work for Ford, I mean, it was the ultimate. I mean, I felt so proud, but also it was like the ultimate. My little rinky-dink small boutique would produce the head of social media for Ford, and of course, he did a great job there, and we become
did a fabulous job.
So. So there you go. I'm looking at a few other comments as well. Marcus Dimbleby said Mossad have their own version. Basically, if you are Israeli, you are naturally, a 10th man. In fact, in Israel, if you are the 10th man to be contrarian, you'll still find someone to disagree with you. But it's funny.
Absolutely.
I mean, this entire culture, that has not culture, whether you want to call it religion, culture, nationality, has, focused on survival. Every day is focused on survival. They're naturally alert. They're naturally contrarian. But I did a bit of research as well, and I'm sure you can talk to it as well, that after coming out of the Yom Kippur War, they started taking this a lot more seriously as well, because I mean, if we've learned anything, is that truth is stranger than fiction. We're certainly kind of living through it right now.
Absolutely. And, you were talking about Dufka in your opening monologue. And, it's funny because you also mentioned Daniel Kahneman. When I was working on my book, I was having breakfast with Daniel Kahneman in New York, and I was explaining this concept of red teaming to him because I wanted to get his opinion and see what he thought. And as you mentioned, this was in the form that it exists today. It was really kind of pioneered in the U.S. military and intelligence community, so its roots go back farther than that. And at the time, I had just graduated from the U.S. Army's Red Team Leader course, and so I was explaining this all to Daniel, and I said, so what do you think? Do you think this will work? And he said, well, I think it'll work better in Israel than it works in America. And he went on to say the same thing that you said. He said, we have a culture where any lieutenant in the Israeli army can argue with any general in the Israeli army, and that will never happen in the United States. But what I think is really cool about this method is while I see his point, there's so many elements of this that are designed to overcome hierarchy and to allow the best idea to surface regardless of where it exists within the organization, that it's basically a way to have those types of tough conversations that happen every day in Israel, as you described, happen in organizations that are not used to that. I've even worked with big organizations in Japan, like the Development Bank of Japan. I mean, Japanese business culture is obviously notoriously very hierarchical, very formal. And there isn't a lot of debate or conflict. And yet, using this approach, people were able to have those kind of hard discussions and surface things that would otherwise have just been kind of swept under the rug.
Well, we're going to start to, get into the red sausage factory in a moment. It does strike me that a word that I didn't even pick up and bring into the soliloquy is the word complacency. And I think at its core, the 10th man or red teaming or this approach speaks to a vigilance, maintaining that vigilance, the edge, right? I mean, I always say the deer, the buck knows every single day that it may very well be pounced on. And if they let down their guard for even a second, it's the end, it's tickets. And complacency has got to be the silent enemy, and maybe not even the not so silent. And I'll tell you very quickly, and I'd love to hear your thoughts, is if ever you ask the question, what if these companies, Sears, JCPenney, Blockbuster, what if these companies had a 10th man? Well, my answer is they they probably would have been laid off. I mean,
Yeah.
they would have been downsized. They would have been marginalized because of what they represented.
Well, yes, except that's the thing is if you make this a defined and it really shouldn't be one person, because if it is one person, even if that's their defined job, it's very easy to say, well, that person's just playing the devil's advocate. We don't have to take them seriously. But if you create a framework for this to be part of your decision-making process as an organization, then you avoid that tendency to just pike the person or the people who tell you what you don't want to hear. And it's essential that you do that, because you're right. That's the tendency. And that's all of these organizations. I firmly believe that in every one of the companies that you've cited, there were not just one or two or three, but probably hundreds or thousands of people who knew exactly what was wrong with the company, who knew exactly how to fix it, who had probably been, banging their head against their boss's door for years, trying to get someone to listen to them, and nobody was. And that's the thing. And I mean, I experienced that firsthand as a business journalist for newspapers. I mean, I'll tell you, Joseph, there's nothing more frustrating than being a business journalist for a newspaper in the 21st century, because you literally spend your day understanding business and how companies should be run. And yet you work in an industry that is dying a death by 1,000 cuts, most of which are of its own infliction.
Yeah.
And because you're a reporter, not on the side, not in the administration or business side of the business, I would go to the publisher and say, this is a colossally stupid move that we're contemplating doing. I know I could point to you two companies that did similar things that just ended up in a horrible mess because of it. And they'd say, what are you talking to me for? You're in the newsroom, go write a story. And I say, you realize I literally spend my day talking to the CEOs of the largest companies in the world, 8 hours a day. And, it's one of the many reasons why I just got out of the business, is because it's so frustrating to know what's going wrong, to see the mistakes and have nothing that you can do to address them.
I mean, I'll tell you a very quick story. Back in round about 2006, just after my first book, Life After the 30-Second Spot, was published, I was invited down to Jamaica to deliver a keynote on the rise of digital to Condé Nast. They had two magazines, Modern Bride and Bride magazine. And I was told to be provocative and, just to be me, basically. But I was also warned not to upset or offend the publisher of, you can't make this up, of the magazines, and basically not to paint the print business, the magazine business, in a negative light. And so, of course, I ignored them. And I basically said, you need to put yourself out of business. You need to, what if you treated your online property or asset the same as you did your offline or your print? Let them both compete against each other. And even if one cannibalizes or cancels out, you'll probably see that when you add up your market share, you end up with a greater than market share. Of course, I don't know that they actually paid my invoice. And neither magazine is a Condé Nast magazine anymore. One, I think, went out of business, and the other one was sold. And my point is, and I actually wrote that into Built to Suck. Here's what strikes me. I'd love to get your thought on it. What if in these companies? So I'm going to give you a contrarian point of view to the contrarian thinking. What if actually the 10th man, or as Tom Morris is asking here, let me find it there. Bob, 10th person, sure, but what if the 10th person in these organizations is in fact the leader? What if the 9 people are actually like yourself, Bryce, like saying, we get it, we understand it, we see it, we feel it, and it's actually, in this case, the contrarian is the person that is perpetuating the status quo?
See, I thought you were going in a different direction than that, because I was all excited. I was thinking, what if the contrarian who's thinking outside the box is the CEO and everyone else is complacent? Then you end up with Apple. You end up with Steve Jobs.
There you go.
But
You just answered an unquestion, which I love too.
Sorry. Well, it's an old interview technique. If you don't want to answer the question that's asked, answer the question you wished was asked. But I do want to answer the question that was asked. It's a good question. I think I've been in companies like that, and I think that the hard truth of it is that those are companies that usually fail, that usually have a colossal disaster unless somebody figures out a way to help the senior leader see what they're missing, which is a hard thing to do. I mean, if I worked at a company like that, I'd probably be getting my resume in order, because if you're into that position where there's one person at the top of the house who's just obstructing the ability of the organization to learn and evolve, it's a very toxic situation. And if there's not a mechanism in place to address that, it's very hard. This is one of the things that there's a lot of rules of red teaming that I learned when I was in the military. And one of the chief ones, one of the principal ones, is you can't red team without top cover. This doesn't work if there's not someone at the top of the house who buys into this. Otherwise, it's a suicide mission.
Yeah.
If you go in an organization like your listener just described there, and tell the CEO, I'm going to be the hero today and tell you what you need to hear, whether you want to listen or not, you're probably going to die on your sword. And that's just the hard reality. So you have two options. One is to wait them out and to try to make change where you can, which is a very important concept, because a lot of times we find ourselves in situations where we do know what's going wrong, and we want to make a positive difference. And so what you can do is look at the part of the organization that you have some control of. And everybody, this is something that organizational psychologists have studied intently. And what they've found is that on average, and this number holds surprisingly well, they've looked at the military, they looked at companies, they've looked at different things. On average, there is at least 15% of your job as an employee in any organization or as a volunteer in a nonprofit that you have some ability to influence. And that's true even if you're a janitor on the factory floor. It's true if you're in the C-suite. It's true anywhere in the middle. So if you focus on your 15% and think about what are the changes that I can make on my level, and if you get other people to do the same thing, you can slowly begin to turn the ship. But one of the things I also am really clear about in my book and in my work is that red team thinking and red teaming is not a cure for toxic leadership. Red teaming can't turn a bad leader into a good leader if they don't want to, but it can turn a good leader into a great leader. And that's the difference. You have to be realistic about things. There are a lot of really badly run organizations out there. I'll tell you a quick story. I am belatedly, and I say belatedly because I've been in the process of doing it for 2 years, and with everything that's happened in the past 12 months or so, I've been delayed in it, but working on launching a podcast. It's called The Thinking Leader. And I did Seth Godin's podcast fellowship, and I had the opportunity to work with some really interesting people on there. And one of the things that in the fellowship is you have to come up with your kind of statement. Seth is very big on what is your statement about your mission, what you're creating for the world. And my statement is that bad leaders react, good leaders plan, and great leaders think. And so I sent that out there to, in his model of instruction is everyone who's in your class kind of gives feedback on everything. So you learn from each other, which is a very powerful model. And it was interesting because about 2/3 of the people in my class were like, wow, that is such a powerful, compelling statement. I love it. That's so cool. And about 1/3 of the people in my class said, oh, you can't say that. There's no such thing as bad leaders. There's just leaders that need help. And I said, no, actually, really, the world is full of bad leaders. And if you don't acknowledge that, then you can't address that fact. And too often organizations, and by organizations I mean like boards of directors who should be having oversight over leadership, kind of say, well, he just needs some help or something like that, and really oftentimes he just needs to be replaced with somebody who has the emotional intelligence and the vision to be able to rethink what's going on, to be open to listening to his or her team, and to be able to take the organization in an evolutionary path rather than doubling down on bad decisions.
It strikes me that in your continuum, and you actually reference that in your article that you wrote for Forbes, Are You a Thinking Leader? But it strikes me that there's a very interesting continuum, Bryce, which is actually, it's again a contrarian way of thinking about. Everyone talks about execution. This is quite the opposite. This says the bad leader just executes, just reacts without, the good leader, introspects and starts to plan, is already thinking about what are we going to do, but takes a little bit more time. But the great leader takes even more time to think. And of course, what really came out of this article is another word, which is listen. Mm-hmm. And again, that flies in the face of the strong, big, bad, bold leaders. Got to talk, got to have a point of view, has to be able to, we absolutely just had a president that would talk, without, maybe all presidents do, in fairness. But it was always overriding to me that I say a little anecdote, and then I want to hear what you think about this continuum, right? Which is, it's actually again a flip on conventional thinking that talks about execution. We sometimes sit down at the dinner table, and my wife, myself, my daughter, and my two sons, and my youngest is 13 years old, and he talks the most. And sometimes what I say to him is, I want you to, here's your age as a percentage of the total ages represented here at the table. All things being equal, you should talk for that same percentage. He does not like this point of view from me. He does not agree to it as well. But anyway, what do you think about this, this reflection that the superpower is really listening, but it's an interesting continuum that you've presented to us?
Well, you're absolutely right. And this is, again, is something I learned from my mentor, Alan Mulally. One of the things that he talks about all the time is that you should seek understanding before seeking to be understood. So the first job of the leader when confronted with a problem is to listen. And I really believe that that's absolutely true. When you were describing this continuum, Joseph, you were making me think about an experience I had. Actually, it was actually the day that Alan Mulally retired from Ford Motor Company. I was in New York at the time, which was fortuitous because I, got calls from all the networks who wanted me to come over and immediately do interviews about his legacy and what was going to happen to Ford. And so, within probably an hour or two of him announcing his retirement, I was on Maggie Lake's show on CNN talking about Alan, and we did our taping. And then when they cut the cameras, and we were, getting unmiked and stuff, she said to me, I have, over the past however many years she'd been doing the show, she said, I've probably had easily half of the CEOs of the Fortune 100 sitting in that chair that you're in there, including Alan. And she said, I have never interviewed a CEO like Alan Mulally. And he's so much what America needs. And I agreed with her. And she said, why do you think that there's so few Alan Mulally's in the world, though? And it's one of those things, Joseph, sometimes somebody asks you a question and the answer just clicks in your head without, like, it's something you've been mulling yourself for a long time. And then someone outside asking that crystallizes it for you. That's what happened there. And I said, because there's so many Jack Welches. And she literally was like, oh my gosh, you are so right. And what we went on to talk about is Jack Welch created this model of the big, I'm sorry, I'm going to use the term that's used in business, the big swinging dick CEO, who has all the answers and is, using his own words, blows things up, shoots from the hip. Look at the names of his books, and stuff. And is this like giant cowboy figure, who can't be challenged and who has this penetrating vision that no one else has. And Alan Mullally's model of leadership couldn't be more different. His is a team-based approach to leadership, where the role of the CEO is more of a coach than a king. And, I remember my very first sit-down interview with him 6 weeks after he took over as CEO of Ford Motor Company. He came down to the Detroit News, where I was working at the time, and sat around the conference table with myself and the senior editors. And the first question that I asked him is, I said, when are you going to start firing these people? Because he hadn't fired anyone. And he said, what do you mean? And we said, well, look, you're surrounded by executives who've been running this company into the ground for a decade or more. In Seattle, presumably, you have a dream team of leaders who helped you save Boeing, not just from one existential crisis, but from two. First, its decades-long battle with Airbus, and then second, from 9/11, which saw almost all of the orders for new planes canceled. When are you going to fire these jokers and bring these people in from Seattle? And he looked at me like I'd said the stupidest thing in the world. And he said, why would I fire these people? He said, these are my job as the CEO is not to bring in my leadership team from Boeing. They don't know how to save Ford Motor Company. The people at Ford Motor Company know how to save Ford Motor Company. My job is to invite these people to join the team. And if they don't want to join the team, they'll self-select out. But my job is to find the people in this company who have the answers and then clear a path for them to execute on that. And go ahead.
No, I was going to say that as well is a contradiction, because most leaders, as you know, they come into a job or position and immediately it's kind of fruit of the poison tree. Everyone associated with the old leader gets whacked. And they bring in it's cronyism at its absolute worst. And that's exactly what happens. It happens in the marketing business, in the advertising business, that an advertising agency that's had a business for decades upon decades, the business is put into review. It is, as you say, the big swinging dick. That's what it is. And that's why these companies and they make the same mistake time after time after time. By the way, I have to tell you, your new book, you're welcome. Here, it's going to be called Cloning Alan Mullally. The new book by Bryce Hoffman. Get it wherever books are sold.
I've had a lot of people ask me how to do that, believe me. But this is the thing. I mean, this is why I wrote the book you have on the screen, though, here, Red Teaming, which is that, after I'm a history buff, so some of my examples are a little arcane. After the Prussians were defeated by Napoleon in the 1790s, they had an incredible moment. And you got to think about this. The Prussians at that point considered themselves to be the greatest military badasses in the world. So the fact that they were beaten by a French corporal was kind of the height of humiliation for them. But they had this amazing moment of self-awareness where the Prussian generals all looked at each other and they said, look, none of us is as good as Napoleon. None of us are the equal of Napoleon. But you know what? Hans over there is as good at cavalry strategy as Napoleon is. And Fritz is as good at logistics and planning as Napoleon is. And instead of us trying to figure out who here is the best person to try to go head to head with Napoleon, why don't we figure out who is the best person at each of these different jobs that are involved in warfighting? And instead of having a senior general who runs our army, let's create a team of generals, and let's call it the general staff. And each person on the general staff will be as good as Napoleon in that one area. And that's what they did. And then they using that model and using proto red teaming, what they called Kriegspiel or war gaming, figured out how to defeat Napoleon with a little help from some folks on an island over on the western part of Europe called Britain. But the point of this is that what the Prussians saw, and why their model was then adopted by pretty much every military in the world since, was that it's a rare thing to have a Napoleon. It's a rare thing to have a Steve Jobs. It's a rare thing to have an Alan Mulally. 99.999% of CEOs are not going to be Alan Mulally. But what you can do is find tools, find methodologies to make up for the fact that you're not. And so the Prussians learned to create the general staff system so that all of them together were as good as Napoleon, or in fact better. And what the tools and techniques of red teaming are designed to do is help you think like a disruptive thinker like Alan Mulally, and learn how to do that, not just by yourself, but as a group. And so I think that's more important than cloning the individual leader, because that's not going to happen as much as we'd like it to happen. I remember in 2007, 2008, having a dinner in Detroit with all the senior guys from BlackRock's automotive business. And they said, oh, the key to saving the auto industry is clear. We just need to get an Alan Mulally to run GM and an Alan Mulally to run Chrysler. Problem solved. And they were serious, though. They had a lot to drink at that point, but they were serious. And I said, what do you mean? And they said, well, clearly the answer is to bring in an outsider. I mean, Bill Ford stepped down running Ford and brought in this guy who was running Boeing, and that's how they saved it. I said, it's not that he's an outsider. I pointed out to him at the time, Bob Nardelli was running Chrysler. He's the former CEO of Home Depot, and he was running Chrysler into the ground faster than anyone had. It's not being an outsider. It's about having this entirely, what I call constructive contrarianism, being able to look at things. What Alan was able to do as an outsider was come in, and everyone would making jokes about him and saying, oh, this guy built airplanes for the past several decades. What does he know about the automobile industry? He doesn't know anything about building cars. He doesn't know anything about how Detroit works. And I asked him early on, I said, you realize people are making jokes about you all over this town saying you don't understand how this business works. And he said, they're right. I don't understand how this business works. But you know what I do understand? It's not working. He said, that's all I need to understand.
Oh man, I love it. I have to find this may be a good time to debut the rim shot. I love that. No, but I mean, it's such a great line, and it did make me think of going back to the importance of the word why, because and I think of the late Sir Ken Robinson. Children are born an eternal optimist and eternally curious. And if you don't ask the question, if you're not brave enough, courageous enough, if you're not able to ask that question, again, what if we're wrong? What if there's a different way? What if there's a better way? If you can't, a different interpretation of why. I mean, you started off by saying how powerful and dangerous it is, but also how just glorious it can be if it is allowed to bloom, and blossom. I want to make sure. I saw a comment from Tom earlier. I love it. He said, "I wish we could continue the show all afternoon." We will be doing an after show in Zoom, and I cannot wait for that as well. We will unleash Tom Morris on you, and you will knock, and maybe a little bit of Scott Monty if he arrives. I want to make sure
I'm ready.
I want to make sure we have an opportunity for you to talk about, get into the essence of the book, and more importantly, what is red teaming? Why is it called red teaming? Where does it come from? How does it work? Just give you an opportunity to introduce, because as you know, I'm fanboy number one when it comes to this. It is literally life and death, I feel, for so many corporations now. I should almost just rip up my book and just say, just read Red Teaming. You want to know how to suck? The key to success is to suck less and red team thinking.
I know. But see, I think the whole sucking thing is a different way of asking the same questions, and so I love that. Where red teaming comes from, where the term comes from, is actually from the story I just told about the Prussians. So I know about Crayola crayons. So I don't know if you remember, but my favorite Crayola color as a kid was Prussian blue. And the reason it was called Prussian blue is because the Prussians back in the 1790s wore these spiffy blue uniforms. And so when they came up with this idea that they called wargaming, that we're going to have this team of generals come up with a plan to defeat Napoleon, but before we risk executing it, we're going to play it out on a tabletop exercise. They made little wooden pieces to represent each army, and they were the Prussians, so their pieces were blue. So they were the blue team, and they were fighting against revolutionary France. So their enemy was the red team. And they got a group of their own best officers to play the other side, to be their own enemy. And that's where this term red teaming comes from. So you have this whole evolution that happens that goes through the Yom Kippur War in Israel that you talked about and other things, but where this really kind of becomes the modern version of what's formally called decision support red teaming is 9/11. So two things happen after 9/11. There's two kind of great epiphanies that happen in the United States. The first happens literally within 24 hours in the CIA. So George Tenet, who was the director of the CIA at the time, at about midnight on the morning of September 12th, so less than 24 hours after the first plane hits the World Trade Center, reactivates. I say in my book activates, but I've since been schooled by people that it was actually reactivating something that had existed previously in the CIA, a group called the Red Cell. Because as you may remember, one of the things that people realized is that there was this huge failure of imagination. The CIA, the FBI, they had all of this information that we were about to be attacked, that we were about to be attacked by airplanes, by Osama bin Laden and his minions, and yet they couldn't connect the dots until the terrorists connected them for them. And so Tenet created the Red Cell with the mission of being the institutional contrarians in the CIA who were going to challenge the thinking of the CIA, and were going to challenge the conclusions the CIA was drawing from intelligence. And obviously, most of the work of the Red Cell is deeply classified, but we can say two things publicly about it. One is, and you can go to the CIA's website, and they talk about this on there, the Red Cell, they say, has been responsible for thwarting at least half a dozen major terrorist attacks against the United States since 9/11 that would have been as big or bigger than the 9/11 terrorist attack. So that's a pretty powerful proof point right there. And the other thing is the Red Cell began a few weeks after it was stood up, producing something called the Alternative Intelligence Assessment. So many people may be aware the President of the United States every day gets a little black folder that is the daily intelligence briefing. It's usually about half a dozen pages, and it says, Mr. President, here's what's happened over the past 24 hours. Here's what we think it means. And here are the options that we think you have to respond to this. And so the Red Cell started producing this addendum that was slipped in one sheet at the back of this, saying, Mr. President, everything you've just read may be wrong. And if it's wrong, here are some alternative ways that you could interpret what's just happened. And here's some alternative courses of action you may wish to consider. Now, it's worth noting, Joseph, that both President Bush and President Obama said publicly that they found the Alternative Intelligence Assessment to be one of the most important things they looked at every day. Trump, his second week in office, said he found it confusing and asked that it be removed from his briefings. He didn't understand why you would have something that said everything you just read may be wrong. So that gives you a sense of what they're doing. And to do that analysis, the CIA developed and dusted off, really, because they developed a lot of these tools during the Cold War, a whole array of groupthink mitigation tools, applied critical thinking tools, analytical tools to look at things from a critical, constructive, contrarian light. So that's the CIA. A couple years later, the other thing that happened from 9/11, as we know, is we invaded Iraq and Afghanistan. And it seemed like things were going fabulously from America's point of view, in the sense that we had fairly easy victories, and we thought, in both countries. And then all of a sudden, though, we weren't winning anymore. And so there was a huge epiphany in the U.S. Army that we had really screwed up and that we needed to do something about it. So there was a new head of the U.S. Army appointed, General Schumacher, and one of the first things that he did was create a lessons learned team to figure out what went wrong and how to avoid it going wrong in the future. And one of the chief conclusions they came up with was what went wrong was we made a lot of really bad assumptions and we didn't challenge those assumptions. And so the recommendation was let's train senior military officers in some of these tools and techniques like the ones the CIA are using to challenge plans, to challenge strategies, to stress test our plans and strategies before we execute them so that we don't make these types of mistakes in the future. And not just that we don't make these mistakes, but that we find the opportunities that we're missing because we're not thinking differently. And they called this red teaming. They set up a school at Fort Leavenworth at the Command and General Staff College to teach these tools and techniques. And that's where I learned about this. We then took these ideas, ported it to business, and instead of having a formal team, the reason we call it red team thinking as opposed to red teaming now is instead of having a team of people do this, we think it's much better to train people, everybody, every decision maker, or as many as possible, in these tools and techniques so they can use them as part of, instead of having this formal process of red teaming, can use them as part of their everyday decision-making practice. Because a practice is a lot more powerful than a process, because a practice is something you do every day as a matter of course. And the more you practice your practice, the better you get. And it's a lot faster too. So that's what this is all about. It's about helping people make good decisions faster in a complex world.
I have decided, so inspired by today and by you, that in my next book and whatever books I write from now, there will always be a one-page addendum at the end of the book that says, "What if I'm wrong?"
I love it.
That's what I'm going to do.
I love it.
And I encourage other authors to do it as well, just in case. Just in case. You know, I call it the Project CYA, but just
Well, you're right. I mean, I'm working on a new version of my book, and one of the things I'm saying is that some of the things I said in here were wrong, like the idea that you need this formal team of people to do this, separate from your planning team. That slows things down too much.
You don't evolve your thinking without being able to put it out there, and then I mean, otherwise, how would you ever know if you were right or wrong? In fact, I started doing this. First of all, whenever I wrote books, I would always write, and I still do, write strategic books, not tactical books, because tactics come and go, right? The other thing is I would always say, to the best of my ability, in this book, I will be talking about a company called Twitter. It is entirely possible that this company may not exist at some point in the future. In fact, it's probably quite likely. And so I would always caveat that at the beginning, but that was kind of my what if I was wrong, less so to kind of, cover my ass, and more just to say, this is the world we're living in. So I better check myself right now on page 1 to not be too absolute, too overconfident, and too definitive.
Well, look at Good to Great. How many of the companies in Good to Great are still great? Don't even ask that question. How many of the companies in Good to Great are still in business? And that's no dig on the book. I think there's a lot of valuable insights in that book. And I think there's a lot that you can, or Built to Last.
Guess why my book is called Built to Suck? Because those visionary companies are not visionary anymore.
And that's the thing is success. My favorite quote from Bill Gates is that success is a lousy teacher. That's what, and it's so true. And he's someone who should know because he ran a company that became a victim at many points in its history of its success, or at least its dominance. And this is what leads companies to become complacent, to stop challenging their thinking, to think that they've cracked the code, and to stop applying the strategic, the intellectual, the tactical, all the levels of rigor that they applied to become successful in the first place. I'll give you a great example, Joseph. When I was, to write this book, I had at the time I mentioned, I was still a consultant, not an unconsultant. And I had my own consulting practice, and to learn how to be a red team leader, I was going to have to shut my business down for a year, and I was going to have to move to Kansas and go, to this army school and all of this stuff like this. And so before I jumped off that diving board, I wanted to see if anyone else besides me thought there was water in the pool. So I talked with a few folks whose opinions I really valued. And one of them was a friend of mine who is former managing partner at Kleiner Perkins. And I described to him this red teaming concept and some of the tools that were involved. And he said, this is fascinating, he said, because this is essentially what we do what we did. He had left recently at Kleiner Perkins. He said, a couple of guys named Larry and Sergey come and knock on our door and say, can you give us $250 million? We want to create a new search engine. And what we do, he said, is we literally put them on a pedestal. And by that, he said, we have these tall bar stools that we sit in the middle of the room. And we have this kind of horseshoe of chairs around it with all of the managing partners of Kleiner Perkins sit in them. And we spend a day grilling them about their business plan, about their vision, about their strategy. And we try our best to poke holes in it. We throw all these what ifs at them. What if this happens? We challenge them with a lot of why questions. And if they can survive that grilling, we write them a check for $250 million. If not, we shake their hand and we show them the door and we tell them there's a bunch of other shops down Sand Hill Road that way. And he said, that's literally the process. And that sounds like what this is. He said, but the thing that's interesting, he said, is we had so many discussions at Kleiner about, wouldn't it be nice if we could have a methodology for continuing to ask those questions of our partners, of our clients, of the companies that we invest in after they get the check. Because some of them, like Google, do continue to challenge themselves and then become great companies. Others have an initial success and then blow it because they get complacent and cocky and think that they've solved the problem. And so that's the value of this approach. This is why it's needed, is because you have to continue to challenge yourself that way. Complacency is the most dangerous thing that any organization faces.
Amen to that. I have one more quote for you, which is, to a contrarian like me, constant advice not to do something almost always starts me quickly down the risky, unpopular path. And that was Michael Bloomberg, who I think knows a thing or two about success and business. Maybe I shouldn't say success. Absolutely. Because it is a lousy teacher. This has been just an absolute joy to be with you, Bryce. It was everything I hoped for and more. 10x, 10x, 10x. I want to leave you guys with a couple of wonderful comments that have come through. Let's see. We've got Stephen Rubin says, what happened to the confidence that you are correct? Well, both Bryce and I know that we are correct, but we're just trying to stay a little bit humble in front of you. Just kidding. Tom Morris has ordered both of your books, Bryce. Marcus Dimbleby says, great quote, Joseph. Fanboy number one, it is literally life and death for major corporations today. Suck less and then try red team thinking. It looks like we found ourselves a nice little 1-2 punch. You and me, Bryce, would take over the world.
Deal.
So,
I've really enjoyed it, Joseph.
I love it. But before we go, yes, but most importantly, let's tell you how you can stay connected with Bryce. You can follow him on Twitter. Do not try and follow him on Facebook because exactly. We'll get into that in the Zoom after show. You can connect with him on LinkedIn. Please go and buy Red Teaming. It is literally the book that will save your life. If you're looking for an endorsement, you just got it. You can find out more about Red Team Thinking at redteamthinking.com. And one more. You have a boot camp. Tell us a little bit about the boot camp in our few seconds left.
Absolutely. The easiest way for people to get their feet wet in Red Team Thinking is we have a self-directed online boot camp that you can sign up for and get exposed to some of these tools and techniques. And if you like what you see, we have a lot of live classes we teach as well.
I tell you who else really, really does like what he sees. Of course, you know who's coming. It's Mr. Chuck Norris.
You are Chuck Norris approved.
There you go. Let's head to the Zoom after show. Thank you, Bryce. That was awesome.
Thank you for watching the show about hope, positivity, optimism, and if there's time left over, a little bit of marketing with your host, multiple author, and global keynote speaker, Joseph Jaffe. If you like the show, tell a friend or two. Please subscribe to the show, and if you want to get inside news, previews of upcoming guests, and much more, visit josephjaffe.com/subscribe to sign up for the show's newsletter.
And despite the best ministrations of your wife, you still look ugly.